Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, September the 9th, 2023, although in New Zealand it's Sunday, September the 10th, where my guest is, and my guest is quite a distinguished figure, unusual character. Lang Leav was born in a refugee camp in Thailand, where her parents were seeking refuge from the Khmer Rouge Regime in Cambodia. Then her family migrated to Australia. She now lives in New Zealand. She's well known around the world, both as the instigator of a cult fashion label, Akina, and now as a very popular poet. Her poetry has sold extremely well. And most interestingly, today she has a new book out. It's called Others Were Emeralds. It's a first novel, or a first adult novel. And as I said, she's joining us from Auckland in New Zealand. Well, congratulations, Lang, on the new book.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me on your show.
I want to get into your story because it's a very unusual one, Lang, later. But you made your name, at least in publishing circles, as a poet. Why the novel? Why not just continue with the poetry?
I think it was just something that it just felt like such a natural progression for me in terms of I was writing longer prose pieces. I was always writing short stories and essays and what have you. So yeah, it just seemed like a natural progression. I always wanted to write about what it was like to grow up in the time that I did, which was a very seminal period in Australia's history. My family and I were the first wave of immigrants to actually grow up in Australia. So that's what my book Others Were Emeralds is based on, and it was just something that, as I said, it was just a natural progression.
Is it? And excuse this question. I'm sure many people have asked it already, and it's a rather crude question for a novelist. But is the novel quite autobiographical?
Well, there definitely are elements that are taken from my life, but I wouldn't say that the narrative is autobiographical. It's obviously completely fictional. But yeah, there are definitely bits and pieces I've taken from my own life, like with every author, and there are stories, especially from my mother. She survived the Khmer Rouge Regime, and yeah, the book is peppered with her stories.
The book is a novel about being a refugee. You've had that experience. How would you define the experience for people who haven't been refugees?
Well, I think it was. I think it would be different for every refugee, and everyone has their own unique set of circumstances. For my family personally, we arrived in Australia in the late 70s, and I was only a baby then. And this was like only less than a decade from the abolishment of the White Australia policy. So we were the first wave of Asian immigrants to grow up in Australia. And my generation was the first. And as you can imagine, Australia back in the 90s, we just looked completely different from every other immigrant. And to make matters worse, the settlement, which my novel is based on, Cabramatta, there were a lot of problems just because we were all thrown into this area, and there was no real help. Everyone had come from war-torn countries. They were suffering from PTSD. They had seen horrific things. So there were a lot of problems in our immediate community. So what you saw in the news all the time was just gang violence, drugs. It was just awful. So sorry about that.
The book itself, as I said, is called Others Were Emeralds. the book is about being a refugee in Australia. It's a book about both the hope and also the intolerance of Australia. You live in New Zealand now. Is there a great deal of difference between Australia and New Zealand when it comes to the experience of refugees?
I think because they were very different times. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. I came to New Zealand in the late 2000s. And I suppose racism is always a present thing. I think if I was looking at it from a personal point of view, there definitely is more tolerance now. And I think that's just because the world has gotten a lot smaller, as you know, with the internet, and there's more sense of globalism. So it's not so strange seeing an Asian person as it was back in the 90s for Australians.
But of course, the world that you're writing about, at least in the novel, is a world of intolerance, of hostility to
Yes.
people's
Mhm.
external appearance. Tell me a little bit about both the fiction and the fact of racism towards immigrants in Australia in the 90s.
Well, like I said, just politically, there was a party known as One Nation. They still exist today. And a politician named Pauline Hanson. And in the mid 90s, she actually made a speech. And I still remember being, I think I was 15 or 16 at the time, and seeing it read in Parliament. And she basically said that we were being swamped by Asians. And then it continued on with a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric. And I think that just made a huge difference. Overnight, there was this almost explosion of racism, and it was something that was being talked about in the media. And there was this feeling of being unsafe. And being a child at the time, my friends and I, we were actually worried that, there's a possibility that perhaps we were going to be kicked out of our country, so to speak. And it seems ridiculous now to think about it, but I think it's because my parents came from a background, where they had to flee their country. And we definitely got that sense at the time.
The novel is about young people. Is there
Mm-hmm.
do you think, in your experience, both as a writer and as someone who came as a very young child, is there a difference in the way in which people like yourself who were born into immigrant families and the parents who came dealt with the experience of race and racism in Australia?
Well, I think. Well, I wasn't born in Australia, but I came when I was quite young, and I think because of that, I was able to learn the language and settle into Australian life, so to speak. And went to school, and I read books. So I think for my generation, there was a sense that we wanted to fit in, we wanted to be Australian, but then we were often told that we were not. And then there was the definite language barrier between our parents and the ideas that they had, they had taken from a completely different culture, and they'd sort of replicated it here because that was all they knew. So absolutely, it was definitely a case of just juggling between two worlds, and always just not really fitting into either one.
There's a great deal of difference, though, between a culture of racism, which is obviously extremely unpleasant and unnerving, and the experience of what your parents and others went through with the Khmer Rouge. Do you think that some of your parents' generation were less affected by the racism that greeted them, if that's the right word, in Australia or New Zealand?
Well, here in Australia, it was pretty hostile. I mean, we had eggs thrown at us. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read Others Were Emeralds, but some of the situations are described in the book. They're taken from real life. For example, I remember it was the bicentenary in Australia, which was being celebrated as Australia's birthday, and it's a complex day because it was obviously the day of the invasion. And I remember being an 8-year-old girl and on the ferry, and being spat on. And yeah, I was standing at the railing. I had a little Australian flag in my hand. And all of a sudden, it was just this massive glob of spit that just landed on my hand. And I just remember turning around in shock. And there was just a group of men just, staring at me. And I still remember the expressions on their faces, and they were just filled with hatred. And that's just something that it's one of my earliest memories. And that's just something that I thought was completely normal growing up. And if I was to step outside of, my immediate hometown, that there definitely would be some kind of a racial altercation.
Lang, what kind of adult grown men, if they were adult grown men, would spit on an 8-year-old girl? Why would they do that?
There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment at the time, in the 80s especially. Like I said earlier, us looking so different to the typical Australian, which was the beach blonde, the macho guy, and that was just a thing that we were seen as almost like subhuman. There were. The media was perpetuating it. There were all these quizzes and things asking whether or not we should be sent back home now that the war was over. It was just a standard thing, unfortunately, in those days. And it wasn't the first time I've had grown men throw slurs at me. It was just a common thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's still hard to understand how a grown man would throw an egg or insult or spit at an 8-year-old girl. And what you went through was probably reasonably typical for young Asian women, or for that matter, men. I'm guessing the men and the boys would have experienced probably something even worse.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a case that I remember where a close family friend of ours, her son was beaten up on the train on the ride home from work. And I just remember being a little girl and going to visit the family, and he was sitting like on the floor in the middle of the lounge room, and he had a blanket wrapped around him, and it was just the most haunting thing. And it's something that still haunts me to this day. And it's just a horrible thing. And it's just one of those things that you can't really believe, especially looking back now in hindsight, how terrible it was. But it just was the norm.
It's hard growing up. Again, you don't need me to tell you this. You're a very successful writer of children's literature and poetry, particularly in that kind of atmosphere. The novel deals with adolescence and awkwardness and safety. How did it affect both you and the fictional characters in Others Were Emeralds to grow up in such a racially hostile environment? What does it do to you?
Well, it's almost like you are in two worlds, and that's what I really wanted to show with my novel, in that that my characters are, they're concerned with things such as, they have school crushes, they're concerned with their friends and how they're perceived, and all the really normal things that teenagers are concerned with. But at the same time, they had all this other stuff going on in the background. They had this almost sense of fear, almost sense that they were different, that they didn't belong. And it was something that was parroted back at us all the time. This isn't your country. You don't belong here. And I suppose it really does have an effect on you. And I think for me personally, it has eroded a lot of my confidence. It's just one of those things.
The book is partly a polemic. It's about fighting the notion that history is bound to repeat itself. Novels are, of course, novels. They're works of art rather than manifestos, but many novels are also trying to make their own argument one way or the other. What are you trying to suggest about the experience of racism in Australia and immigration in your book?
I think that I set out to write it as authentically as what I possibly could. I don't really want to have an agenda or put too many points of views across. I think in fiction, it's important not to do that. So yeah, I just let my characters take the lead. And, knowing the nuance of what it was like to grow up really helped in writing the characters. So yeah, I was able to be very sensitive to their experiences, and I was able to convey it in a way that is authentic and that was resonant to how they live their lives.
We are speaking to Lang Leav, who is the author. Many of you will know her poetry. She has a new book out, a first-time adult novel. Others were Emeralds. It's a novel about growing up in a highly racist, anti-Asian culture and society in Australia. Lang, we're going to take a short break now. I want to remind people of our sponsor, Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. And then I want to come back and I want to talk a little bit more about social media and how things have changed since the 90s. So stay with us, everyone. We're with Lang Leav, the distinguished poet and author, and she has a new novel out. Others Were Emeralds. We'll be back in 2 seconds.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can learn more about Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are talking with Lang Leav, the author of a wonderful new novel, Others Were Emeralds, a book about the 90s in Australia. Lang, one thing that's changed, I guess, over the last 30 years in terms of when you set your novel and today is the appearance of the internet. Your book is set in the last dying gasps, I guess, of an analog world. Is that coincidental?
Yeah, in a way. I just set it to my own timeline. I is about my protagonist is the same character, the same age as me. I do remember what it was like with the advent of the internet and when it first came in. I'm probably like the generation to really know what it was like to go through that time, from when email became a thing to, forums and then going into chat and IRC and what have you. So yeah, they were things that I could really write about in the book.
How much do you think, Lang, technology has changed the world? You broke through in part with your popularity on social media. You have over 500,000 followers on Twitter, as well as on Instagram. I think you made a name originally on Tumblr, and on Facebook you have over 1 million followers. Do you think that social media has, in overall terms, acted against racism, changed the culture since the 90s? Has it played an important role?
I think that's a really tricky question. I mean, I think the internet is it's not a real representation of our world, if that makes sense. I think it's a place where the loudest voices get the most attention, and I think because of that, it is hard to really differentiate what is real and what isn't. So I think I have a very deep mistrust of what I see on the internet or what I read. And you have to take everything with a grain of salt because truly it is a place, I suppose, where the ones that do the best are based on outrage and anger and a lot of other negative things like that. I mean, there is also a lot of positivity and wonderful things with human beings connecting. But I think it's about just going into the internet with a very open mind and just resisting just resisting that natural impulse just to, if you see something, to make judgments on it or to believe that it's actually true.
But it does provide communities. You noted earlier that one of the experiences of growing up in the racist world of Australia in the 90s was it was honestly isolating. On the internet, there are always communities for everyone. At least that was the argument of many of the supporters of social media. You don't
Yeah.
strike me as a particularly loud, abrasive person, but you have a significant following. So it is possible to find people like yourself online, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I remember in the 90s, when I first got onto the internet, it was largely text-based. So, we didn't have images or what have you. And I think that was my favorite time of the internet, when everything was just text-based, and you had this anonymity. And there was a sense of freedom there for me, in that for the first time in my life, how I looked wasn't a factor, and I could freely communicate without any prejudice or judgment. And I absolutely loved that era of the internet. Obviously, Tumblr as well. That's a very, even though there was imagery, it's a very, how do you say, a very insular social media. And I'm not on Tumblr anymore. That's not my account, by the way. I think that's just a fan account.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think anyone's on Tumblr anymore.
No, I
You
haven't been
did
on.
make your name. I think it was one of the platforms that you made your name on originally.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was still very text-based. At the time, I wasn't really uploading any images or what have you. It was mainly just writing. And that's where I think I'm the most comfortable. If I had a choice between writing or speaking, I would definitely choose writing. I just feel that it's a more, just a more natural way for me to communicate.
But Lang, not necessarily speaking of yourself, but for more in a more broad context, should we welcome media that allows people to escape from how they look, and thereby closing the door on a kind of racism? Shouldn't everyone see what other people look like?
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just talking from my point of view in the 90s. It's a completely personal point of view, that I felt that freedom. And I had that same exact feeling when I went to an all Asian country for the first time, that I could just, wander around incognito. And I think if you're a minority in a country and you're used to being stared at, or you've got all this unwanted attention, it's just such a lovely thing. So yeah, I'm going more based on that. In terms of the internet being more visible, I guess there are good things about that, absolutely, in that, I guess it's a lot harder to cause a lot of mischief if you've got your face to something, even though that doesn't stop most people. Yeah, so absolutely agree. There are pros and cons, like with everything.
What's your take, Lang, on what some people see as the epidemic of anxiety amongst especially younger people who have come online? Is there a connection? Some psychologists suggest that we've got an infestation, an epidemic of anxiety that began in around 2012, which of course is when the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the Twitters began to take off. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I myself, I know what it's like to have anxiety. And, like I mentioned before, I'm not very good just, showing my face or speaking like I am now. It's not something that I've ever been super comfortable with. But yeah, I like I said, I'm not an expert on the topic. I know what it's like to have anxiety, and I absolutely empathize with people who struggle with anxiety. I know it can be quite debilitating. I remember probably in the early 2000s, I was going through a tough time, and I was looking online, but there wasn't a lot of resources. So I'm glad that there's support, and like you said, there's a community for that, and people who are struggling can find solace and help in others.
Are you concerned with the way in which social media today has become increasingly a refuge for hatred and hostility to people of different skins and genders and one kind of identity or another?
Absolutely. I just think that, like I said, the internet isn't the real world. And I think that's hard for a lot of young people to understand, just because they've grown up always having the internet. But for those of us who know what it was like before the internet, I think it's a little bit easier for us to grasp the concept that it isn't the real world, and what you see is not real, and it's a representation and not a very accurate one. So I wouldn't get too caught up in it. That would be my advice. It's something that you can participate in, but you shouldn't live your whole life based on what you see or read online.
You said that the internet is not the real world. You've just written a novel. Others were emeralds. Is that the real world? Were you in some ways trying to create or recreate the real world in your novel?
Well, I think as authors, there's always this process we go through when we're working on a manuscript. Well, for me personally, when I work on a manuscript and the characters start to speak to me, or they feel alive, then I know it is going to be a book, if that makes sense. I've started many novels, and for whatever reason, the characters just never animate. And I absolutely do feel that my characters, they feel real to me. And I think that's just a lovely thing. I feel sometimes that they drive decisions, they make their own choices, and they lead me down really interesting narrative paths.
Can a novel be, in a sense, more real than the world itself, the physical world?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. I think there is just, there can be so much authenticity to be found in fiction. And that's something that I've always believed, and fiction is something that I've always loved.
But why is the authentic real? Some people might suggest you can create authentic characters in literature because they're not real, and that in the world itself, people aren't authentic.
Well, I don't think it's a black and white thing. I just think that some people are authentic, other people aren't. All people have their motives and agendas. It's just something that I just try to stay away from. I exist mainly in the real world and my real life. And yeah, that's just from a personal standpoint.
Lang, have you spent much time in the United States?
I visited a few times. I was there on tour, so I haven't had an opportunity to really, do all the touristy stuff, but I'd love to visit again. I had always planned to, but then, there was COVID, and I didn't get a chance to come back.
We in America, or maybe I don't know, I can speak on behalf of Americans generally, but in the late 2010s, of course, we went through the Trump years.
Yeah.
There's still many people fear an undercurrent of racism, of hostility to people of different skins and races. During COVID, there was enormous hostility towards Asians in America. America's gone through these cycles before.
Yeah.
Japanese feeling during the Second World War.
Yeah.
What advice would you give Americans who are struggling with this? Not that Australia or New Zealand has necessarily overcome this, but what would you say to Americans who are struggling with the same racism and hostility that you write about in the novel Others Were Emeralds, and which you've experienced in your life?
It's just an absolutely horrible thing. And the thing is, I don't know what I can say, because what it does is it puts you in a position where you're almost powerless. And you're always caught in this situation where, like, how far is going too far? Like, if someone, says, tries to speak to you in your language, is that condescending? Are they doing it out of goodwill? Like, like, how far does it go? And that's a terrible thing about racism. It makes you completely hypersensitive. And if you get it wrong, then you just end up in a much worse place, and it just completely, you get, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, so what I'm trying to say basically is that I'm not sure what to say. It's a terrible thing. It takes away your power, and it's a horrible thing. And I think raising awareness about it is fantastic, definitely. And if you ever see someone going through that situation, or they're being targeted, if you could just speak up, because a lot of racists are cowards. And
I hope if I ever saw a group of men spitting on an 8-year-old girl, I would do something. I mean, we always like to think we would. Whether we're
Yeah.
brave enough is another question. Did you or have you ever thought of just giving up the whole thing? You mentioned going back to Asia and being less noticeable. Did you think to yourself at any point, I'm just going to go back to a community where everyone looks like me?
Well, yeah, it's tempting, but I love where I am, and I feel that I am Australian, and now I'm a New Zealander. And that's, you know, I've been here many years. It's formed a part of my identity, and I think I'll be living either in New Zealand or Australia going forward.
Why did you move from Australia to New Zealand?
Oh, I met my partner about, was it like 13 years ago? And his son was here, so I moved over here, and now Ollie, he's just turned 20 actually, and he's studying in Australia. He's a physics major, so we're looking at possibly going over there now to be closer to him.
Do you think New Zealand is a slightly more tolerant society than Australia? Always has the reputation as being.
I think so. Like I said, I can't really judge it just because I wasn't here during the 80s and 90s. But definitely since I've been here, there've been definitely some cases of racism, but not to the extent that I experienced when I was younger.
Well, final question, Lang. As I said, your new book is out, your first novel. Others were emeralds. Should we expect more literature, more poetry, more fashion brands from Lang Leav? What's your next project?
Well, I recently sold another book to Harper Perennial, which I'm very, very excited about. It's a novel, and it should come out in 2025. And the character is in her late 20s. So we're going to that period of the early, the early advent of social media. So it's a very interesting look at that time from the perspective of a second-generation immigrant.